At 9 a.m. on July 4th, 1943, Private First Class Evan Evans hunkered down behind sandbag fortifications on Renova Island, his knuckles white from gripping the cold metal of his 90-millimeter gun as he locked eyes on 16 Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers emerging from tattered clouds above Blanche Channel. At 22 years old, he'd endured 3 grueling weeks of this mud-choked hellscape, swarmed by mosquitoes, sleeping in rain-soaked foxholes and carrying the weight of 0 enemy aircraft shot down to his name. The bombers, their engines roaring like distant thunder, were barreling straight for a stretch of beach the Marines had grimly dubbed Suicide Point, a blood-stained site where 59 American lives had been snuffed out just 48 hours prior, their bodies still being recovered from the sand and surf. July 2nd had been a catastrophic day for Renova, a date etched into every Marine's memory. The Japanese had unleashed 18 bombers and 440 fighters in a relentless assault, and a prior raid had knocked the island's radar systems completely offline, leaving them blind to the incoming threat. Deprived of early warning, the Marines were caught utterly unprepared when the Bettys roared in low over the water at 2 p.m., skimming just above the wave crests to avoid detection. Their first targets were fuel depots, which erupted in towering fireballs that painted the sky orange, followed by ammunition stockpiles that detonated in deafening bursts, and finally the field hospital where wounded troops lay helpless, waiting for evacuation. Evans had watched the carnage unfold from his gun position, frozen by the horror. Flames consumed the beach, turning it into a searing inferno that melted boots to sand, while explosions hurled debris 300 feet into the sky, raining shrapnel down on anyone in its path. Marines raced through the fire to reach the injured, their screams drowned out by the chaos, but most never made it. 77 more were wounded, 4 of them from the 9th Defense Battalion's 90-millimeter anti-aircraft gun crews, their bodies carried away on stretchers. The battalion lost 2 of its 6 155-millimeter long-tom artillery pieces. Trucks melted into twisted heaps of metal, and ammunition cooked off in relentless bursts for 6 hours straight, the crackle of exploding rounds echoing through the night. The Japanese had named their target well. Suicide Point had lived up to its name. Suicide Point jutted from Renova's northern tip, a bottleneck every supply ship had to pass. Every Marine on the island could see its smoldering ruins. Evans and his gun crew had fired 32 rounds that day, hitting nothing. The Bettys were too fast. Radar operators worked blind, and gun directors struggled to calculate intercepts using only binoculars and stopwatches. By the time their shells reached the proper altitude, the bombers were long gone. That night, Lieutenant Colonel William Scheer gathered the 90-millimeter crews, his words sharp and unflinching. The radar sets were destroyed, replacement parts wouldn't arrive for days, and the Japanese would return. They always did. Next time, he warned, there might not be enough Marines left to bury the dead. Evans cleaned his weapon until 3 a.m. The 9-ton M190-millimeter anti-aircraft gun, a silent, imposing sentinel beside him in the pitch-black night. By the dim glow of a covered flashlight, he scraped caked mud and gunpowder residue from the breach, his movements methodical and precise, equal parts ritual and preparation. The M1 was a marvel of engineering. It could hurl a 24-pound shell to 33,000 feet at a maximum rate of 28 rounds per minute, its barrel built to withstand relentless fire. But without radar, none of that raw firepower mattered. The Betty bombers topped out at 270 miles per hour, crossing 2 miles in just 27 seconds, far too fast for human eyes to track or mechanical calculators to lock onto. Evans knew that without early warning, their guns were little more than expensive scrap metal, waiting to be targeted again. The 9th Defense Battalion had landed on Renova on June 30th, tasked with protecting the beachhead, while Army artillery pounded Japanese positions on New Georgia across the channel. Equipped with 3 batteries of 90-millimeter guns, 4 per battery, 12 total, they were supposed to weave an impenetrable umbrella of flak. Instead, they'd become little more than target practice. July 3rd brought a downpour, turning Renova into a waterlogged swamp. Marines stood guard in knee-deep muck, and supplies rotted on the beach. But the rain offered one crucial reprieve. The Japanese avoided flying in heavy weather. The battalion seized the lull to make repairs. Salvage teams scavenged parts from damaged equipment, and mechanics worked through the night. By dawn on July 4th, hope flickered. Radar operators reported their SCR-268 sets were operational. Not perfect, but functional. Gun directors tested their gear, fire control systems glowed green, and communications linked all 12 gun positions. Evans loaded shells into the ready rack, his crew moving through drills they'd rehearsed 10,000 times in training. But no amount of practice could prepare them for the terror of Betties dropping bombs on their brothers in arms. At 8:45 a.m., radar picked up a large formation approaching from Rabaul, 120 miles out, bearing 320 degrees, altitude 14,000 feet. The planes were flying straight down the slot, dead set on Renova. Scheer gave the order. All crews stood ready. This time they had radar. This time they'd see the Japanese coming. And this time Evan Evans was about to rewrite the rules of Pacific air defense, if he survived long enough to do it. Radar operators called out updates every 30 seconds, their voices cutting through the tension. The Japanese formation split. One group veered toward New Georgia, while the other 16 bombers, escorted by 180 Zeros, pressed straight for Renova, descending steadily to 12,000 feet. The island's combat air patrol had been diverted north to intercept another raid, leaving the 90mm guns to stand alone. Evans fixed his gaze on the gun director, a Sperry M4 mechanical computer designed to translate radar data into intercept coordinates. In theory, the M4 sent electrical signals to the gun mount, adjusting elevation and azimuth automatically. In practice, it was built for optical tracking, not radar, creating awkward, imprecise connections. Even the best crews could only land shells within 200 meters of a target, and with a 90mm shell's 50-meter burst radius, multiple guns firing in tandem were needed to score a hit. Evans had only one. Battery C, Gun 3. At 70 miles out, the radar plot showed the bombers in a tight V formation, a textbook Japanese tactic. The Betties would strike at medium altitude, drop their payloads, and flee hard while Zeros fended off pursuers. Renova had no pursuers. At 9:15 a.m., the air raid siren wailed, a guttural sound that emptied the beach in seconds. Marines dove into foxholes, medics grabbed their kits, and Seabees abandoned supply ships to take cover. Only the gun crews remained, rooted to their positions. Evans checked his ammunition. High explosive shells fitted with variable time fuses, adjustable in half-second increments. At 10,000 feet, a shell took 18 seconds to reach its detonation point, 1 second off, and it would burst too high or low, missing by half a mile. The Japanese held steady at 10,000 feet, an altitude that evaded most light anti-aircraft fire, but sat well within the 90mm gun's range. The bomber crews had seen American flak before. For 18 months, they'd flown through it with impunity, dismissing it as a minor nuisance. They were about to learn otherwise. At 30 miles out, Scheer gave the order to fire, his voice cutting through the radio static with unwavering authority. All 12 guns erupted simultaneously, the noise so deafening it felt like a physical blow. Each fired a shell every 3 seconds, 24-pound projectiles screaming skyward at 2,800 feet per second, leaving trails of smoke in their wake. The concussion of muzzle blasts shook dust from sandbags, rattled teeth, and made speech impossible. Evans communicated with his crew through hand signals alone, their movements synced by months of grueling training. He fell into a ruthless rhythm, his crew moving on pure muscle memory. The loader, Roy Boone, grabbed a shell from the ready rack with calloused hands. The rammer drove it home with a thunderous clank. The fuse setter dialed in the exact time with steady fingers. The breech closed with a sharp click. The gun fired, and the empty casing ejected onto the mud with a metallic clatter. 3 seconds per cycle, repeated without pause, their bodies aching but their focus unbreakable. The repaired SCR-268 radar fed data to the gun directors faster than the M4 computers could process it, the machines clicking and whirring frantically as they adjusted elevation and azimuth to match the bomber's rapid approach. At 20 miles out, the first American shells burst overhead, black puffs dotting the sky ahead of the formation. The Japanese adjusted course slightly but kept coming. Evans watched through his gun sight as his shells exploded 500 meters from the lead bomber. Close, but not close enough. A Betty's 82-foot wingspan meant near misses were meaningless. Only direct hits or pinpoint bursts could bring it down. By 15 miles, the Marines had fired 88 rounds. Then at 12 miles, the lead Betty began its descent to 8,000 feet, attack altitude. The bomber's sights locked onto Renova, a stationary target impossible to miss. In 3 minutes, they'd be overhead. In 4, they'd drop their bombs. Evans's gun grew hot beneath his hands, the barrel temperature climbing dangerously with each shot, its metal radiating waves of heat that singed the air. Overheat it, and the rifling would warp, rendering the weapon useless and leaving them defenseless against the oncoming bombers. But there was no time to let it cool, no luxury of pausing for even a breath. The Japanese weren't waiting, their bombers closing in with every passing second. At 10 miles out, Battery C's gun director locked onto the lead bomber. Its radar returned strong and clear, cutting through the static like a beacon. The M4 calculated an intercept with uncanny precision, its gears whirring as it adjusted the gun's aim. 2 degrees up, 3 degrees left. Evans squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The shell tore through 8,000 feet of humid tropical air, its fuse counting down the seconds until detonation. 18 seconds later, it exploded 200 meters ahead of the lead Betty, directly in its flight path. Shrapnel shredded the right engine, which erupted in a ball of fire, black smoke billowing from the damaged compartment like a funeral veil. The pilot fought to hold formation, a testament to Japanese discipline, but the fire spread rapidly, consuming the right wing in 30 seconds, the flames licking at the fuselage as the plane began to falter. The bomber fell out of formation, losing altitude steadily before rolling sharply to the right and crashing into the channel 4 miles northwest of Renova, sending a plume of water and smoke into the sky. 1 down, 15 to go. And a flicker of hope ignited in Evans's chest. The remaining bombers tightened their ranks, now 7 miles out, close enough for Evans to see their dark, cross-shaped silhouettes against the sky. Their bomb bays yawned open. Battery C fired relentlessly, joined by the other 90mm guns, filling the sky with flak. When the smoke cleared, 2 more Bettys trailed smoke. One lost its tail and spun out of control. The other limped on failing engines. Neither made it past 5 miles. 3 down. Panicked, the Japanese released their bombs early, dumping 8,000 pounds of explosives per plane into the ocean half a mile offshore. Geysers erupted, but not a single bomb touched Renova. The bombers fled west, but they were still in range, slower now, weighed down by armor and defensive guns, climbing to escape flak. Climbing made them predictable. Battery C's director locked onto a mid-formation Betty. Evans adjusted, fired, and the shell burst 50 meters below its belly. The concussion wave slammed into the aircraft, pitching its nose down. The pilot lost control, plunging into an unrecoverable dive. 4 down. The formation shattered, each pilot flying for survival, some west to New Georgia, others northwest to Rabaul. The Zeros vanished, abandoning their charges. Evans's gun barrel glowed red-hot, heat waves rising from the metal. His crew had fired 42 rounds in 7 minutes, pushing the M1 beyond its sustained fire limits. A Betty fleeing west toward New Georgia climbed to 9,000 feet, hoping altitude would save it. Battery C's radar locked on, and Evans fired twice. The first missed high, the second burst 30 meters behind the tail, severing elevator controls. The Betty spun into the New Georgia jungle 3 miles inland. 5 down. 2 more Bettys hugged the 5,000-foot mark, trying to evade radar, but the SCR-268 tracked targets down to 3,000 feet. Battery C took the lead bomber, Battery E the trailing one. Both fired, both hit. The lead Betty's port engine exploded, folding its wing and sending it crashing into the channel. The second lost its tail, plummeting seconds later. 7 down. 3 Bettys fled due west for the open ocean, 400 miles from home, their engines screaming as they burned fuel to escape the deadly flak. Evans tracked the nearest one through his gun sight, his eyes stinging from smoke and fatigue, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. The first 2 missed, bursting harmlessly in the sky, but the third exploded directly under the bomber's fuselage. its force tearing open the bomb bay like a tin can. Unspent 500-pound bombs detonated on impact, disintegrating the aircraft in a massive fireball that lit up the morning sky, pieces of metal and debris scattering across half a mile of ocean. 8 down. Other batteries joined the fray, their guns barking in unison. Battery E claimed 2 more bombers in rapid succession, their shells finding their marks with deadly accuracy, while Battery A took out another, sending it spiraling into the channel. The sky became a chaotic shooting gallery, black puffs of flak mixing with smoke from burning aircraft. Evans swung his gun north to target a Betty, climbing desperately to 11,000 feet. Well within the M1's 33,000-foot effective range. He fired, and the shell arced high into the sky, bursting 200 meters ahead of the fleeing plane. The pilot, panicked, swerved right, flying straight into the path of Evans's next round. The blast tore through the cockpit, killing the crew instantly, and the bomber tumbled out of control, crashing into the ocean 9 miles north of Renova in a plume of white water. 9 down, and the tide of the battle had irrevocably turned. By 9:30 a.m., the smoke began to clear, carried away by the gentle ocean breeze, revealing a sky streaked with faint traces of black soot. Of the 16 bombers that had descended on Renova, only 4 remained, fleeing northwest at maximum speed, their engines straining to carry them to safety. Battery C fired one last shot at 12 miles. Too far for a kill, but a deliberate message. Renova was no longer suicide point. It was a killing ground, a place where American grit and ingenuity had turned the tables on the enemy. At 9:32 a.m., the ceasefire order came over the radio, its static-laced voice a welcome reprieve. The sudden silence was jarring after 27 minutes of constant gunfire, the absence of noise leaving a ringing in Evans's ears that drowned out all else. He stepped back from his gun, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of nonstop combat, his uniform soaked through with sweat and dirt. His crew collapsed against the sandbags, their shoulders slumping as the adrenaline faded, their bodies aching from the repetitive motion of loading, ramming, and firing. Battery C's log showed 53 rounds fired from Gun 3 alone. Across Renova, 88 rounds total had engaged 16 bombers. The results were unprecedented, beyond anything any anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific had ever achieved. At 10:10 a.m., Shire walked the gun line, tallying claims. Battery C had 4 confirmed kills, Battery E 3, Battery A 2. By 10:30 a.m., radar operators confirmed the toll. 12 bombers down, 4 fleeing. 12 destroyed in 27 minutes. A record no American anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific had ever matched, not at Guadalcanal, Midway, or anywhere else. The 88 rounds translated to a 14% hit rate, a staggering number compared to the typical 2% average. More than just a kill count, the crew had shattered a Japanese attack that carried 128,000 pounds of explosives. Not one bomb hit Renova. The 4 fleeing bombers were damaged. Radar tracked them limping northwest, and 2 likely ran out of fuel over the Solomon Sea, ditching in the ocean. By 11 a.m., work parties recovered debris from the water, engine cowlings, wing sections, a tail with the Japanese rising sun still visible, spread across 5 miles of channel. The beach came back to life. Seabees resumed unloading supplies, Marines emerged from foxholes, and life on Renova continued. But something fundamental had shifted. The island, once known as Suicide Point, had proven it could defend itself. Evans cleaned his gun at 1 p.m., the barrel still too hot to touch, but the rifling intact, the M1 having endured punishment that should have destroyed it. Crews across the island did the same, cleaning, inspecting, reloading. They knew the Japanese would return, but next time, they'd remember July 4th. That afternoon, a Marine combat photographer arrived at Battery C, wanting to document the crew with the most kills. Evans, Roy Boone, and John Gamborowski stood beside their 90mm gun, posing for 6 photos. Only one survived the war, archived as National Archives, Photo 127GW, captioned, "This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Renova Island." While the Marines counted their kills, 400 miles northwest in Rabaul, Japanese commanders received alarming reports from the surviving bombers. The Americans had accurate, cloud-penetrating, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire capable of guiding shells to within meters of targets. Every Japanese airbase in the Solomons was now vulnerable. The math of Pacific air combat had changed. Japan would either adjust tactics or abandon daylight raids. Admiral Halley's headquarters sent a message at 4 p.m. Confirm kill count. Shire replied, 12 Bettys destroyed, 4 damaged, 88 rounds expended, 0 American casualties, 0 bombs hit. 30 minutes later, a second message arrived. A demand for a full after-action report detailing radar settings, fire control procedures, and how the battalion achieved a 90% destruction rate. The reports traveled up the chain from Renova to 14th Corps to South Pacific Area Command to Pearl Harbor, spreading the 9th Defense Battalion's tactics across the theater. The Japanese tested Renova again on July 5th. 6 bombers, night raids from 20,000 feet, no hits. The 9th Defense Battalion fired 37 rounds, claiming 2 hits. July 6th brought 4 more bombers, same result, 1 shot down, no damage to the island. By July 10th, Japanese raids had nearly stopped. Only 2 small, ineffective high-altitude attacks followed on July 20th and August 1st. Japan had conceded Renova's airspace. With Renova secure, the 155mm Long Toms pounded Japanese positions on New Georgia 24/7, paving the way for the American advance on Munda Airfield. Munda fell on August 5th, and by August 14th, American fighters were flying missions from the captured base. The New Georgia campaign, launched June 30th, ended in 5 weeks. In October, the 9th Defense Battalion moved to New Georgia to defend Munda. No counterattacks came. Japan had retreated to Bougainville, the momentum firmly in American hands. Evans and his crew spent 6 months on New Georgia, shooting down 3 more reconnaissance planes, nothing compared to July 4th. The Marine Corps later called that day one of the most successful anti-aircraft engagements of the Pacific War. But it came with a hidden cost. Killing 12 bombers meant killing over 100 Japanese aircrew. Some survived crashes, floating in the ocean as American ships passed by. War's rules faded in survival's shadow, and Evans carried that weight for life. The battalion remained on New Georgia until March 1944, then deployed to Guam for the July 21st landing. They set up guns around the beachhead, fighting Japanese troops dug into jungles and caves. Dengue fever swept the unit in August. Evans spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, losing 20 pounds, and returned to find the battle over. The 9th Defense Battalion stayed on Guam for the war's remainder, protecting B-29 bases from occasional night raids, adding 6 more kills to their total, 46 for the war. Evans was promoted to sergeant by VJ Day in August 1945, 24 years old with 3 years in the Marines and 2 campaigns under his belt. The battalion returned to the U.S. in February 1946, sailing into San Diego Harbor on the 23rd. Their uniforms faded and their bodies marked by the scars of combat. They were deactivated in March at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and the Marines scattered across the country, back to Indiana, back to Michigan, back to the lives they'd left behind when war had called. Evans went home to Richmond, Indiana, a decorated sergeant with a chest full of citations. But the quiet Midwestern town felt unchanged, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd endured. The war had etched itself into his soul, changing him more deeply than any medal or promotion ever could. He re-enlisted in 1948, seeking the structure and camaraderie he'd lost in civilian life, served through the Korean War, rose to the rank of staff sergeant, and finally retired in 1953 after 11 years of faithful service. He found work as a machinist, a trade that let him work with his hands, much like he'd done with his 90mm gun, and married, raising a family in the quiet comfort of small-town life. He rarely spoke of Renova, though. Most veterans didn't. The memories were too raw, too personal. Those who'd been there shared an unspoken bond, while those who hadn't couldn't possibly understand the horror of watching friends die, the thrill of a kill, and the weight of survival. In 1993, 50 years later, A Marine Corps researcher found Photo 127GW in the National Archives and tracked down Evans, then 72. He'd thought everyone had forgotten. Alan Walker, the archivist who found the photo, had received a letter from Evans asking for a picture of an M1 gun to show his grandchildren. Mention of Renova and July 4th led Walker to the iconic image of Evans, Boone, and Gamborowski. Evans was stunned. He'd never known the photo existed. Seeing his 22-year-old self beside the gun brought back decades of suppressed memories, and for the first time, he began to process them. Evans died in 2004 at 83, surrounded by his family. Boone had passed in 1998, Gamborowski in 2006. Their bodies were laid to rest, but their story survived, along with the life-saving tactics pioneered that fateful day at Renova. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire became standard procedure across all American forces, kill ratios improved dramatically, and Japanese daylight raids vanished by 1945, a casualty of the lessons learned at Suicide Point. Renova's beach is quiet now, the sand reclaimed by jungle, the bunkers collapsed and overgrown, the echoes of gunfire long faded. But every July 4th, a few people remember: veterans, historians, and the families of those who fought. They remember 3 young Marines who turned a death trap into a fortress, who rewrote the math of Pacific air defense in 27 minutes with 88 rounds, and who proved that courage and precision could overcome even the darkest odds. Their legacy isn't just in the records or the photograph, it's in the lives saved by the tactics they pioneered, a silent tribute to the men who stood their ground when all seemed lost. If this story moved you, hit the like button to help YouTube share it with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten WWII stories from archives every day. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if someone in your family served, let's keep these memories alive. Thank you for ensuring Evan Evans and his crew are never lost to silence. These Marines deserve to be remembered.